Again, controversial, but sometimes you've crushed your sex hormone-binding globulin so low, and serum estradiol concentrations are so low that you don't want to wait until the ACG starts to get into effect. Vigorous Steve here. What is that? You've crushed your sex hormone-binding globulin concentrations to 5 nanomoles per liter because you megadose proviron in an attempt to increase your libido, but now your sex drive is on a scale from 1 to 100, basically as high as your sex hormone-binding globulin concentrations, and you've spent all of your money on PT141 and tadalafil, based on my previous videos about libido, and you've done everything right, but now you're close to bankruptcy and you can't possibly afford a consultation with me. Don't worry, Coach Steve has your back. Let's discuss a protocol to restore sex hormone-binding globulin concentrations to libido and anabolism favorable ranges while you're on performance-enhancing drugs. So here is the protocol for you if you find yourself in a situation where your sex hormone-binding globulin is low and your libido and anabolism is suffering because of it. Don't worry, there's methods to restore it reasonably fast. Now, sex hormone-binding globulin is, as the name implies, a protein molecule that binds sex hormones, testosterone, dihydrotestosterone, estrogens being the estrone, estriol, estradiol, and to a certain extent they also bind up DHEA, pregnenolone, and progesterone. All of these hormones have different affinities for the sex hormone-binding globulin. Now, contrary to popular belief, sex hormone-binding globulin doesn't inactivate all of the sex hormones. Actually, it delivers some of these sex hormones to tissue through the sex hormone-binding globulin receptor complex, increasing an anabolic pathway, being the androgens delivery, and maybe even the estradiol. There's a little bit of anabolism attached to estradiol as well. They deliver sex hormones to tissue through the sex hormone-binding globulin receptor complex, allowing the testosterone or the testosterone derivatives or the estrogens to attach to their specific nuclear receptors, being the androgen receptors or the estrogen alpha and beta receptors. So you get a little bit of anabolism that way. And the lower your sex hormone-binding globulin goes, the lower your anabolic potential is going to be. And in most cases, libido is going to go down with it, because libido is not only determined by free testosterone concentrations in the bloodstream. It's hormone balance that contributes to libido. I made many videos about this, so we're mostly going to focus about the anabolism and increasing sex hormone-binding globulin concentrations. So what can we do to increase sex hormone-binding globulin while staying on cycle? Well, a couple things you have to keep in mind is that dihydrotestosterone derivatives, including dihydrotestosterone, have a higher binding affinity to sex hormone-binding globulin than testosterone itself, often 5 times or more binding affinity. And proviron is the biggest culprit, which has basically the highest binding affinity to sex hormone-binding globulin, allowing free testosterone concentrations to increase because proviron is taking the place of testosterone in the sex hormone-binding globulin. Unfortunately, delivering proviron to tissue doesn't give you any anabolism because proviron and masterone and aromacin are probably horrible compounds for anabolism. And there's much better compounds to choose from. So again, proviron use maybe 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks at most, reducing your sex hormone-binding globulin concentrations if you come from a state where sex hormone-binding globulin is absolutely high to the point libido is impaired. But honestly, going on anything over testosterone replacement therapy will automatically bring your sex hormone-binding globulin down, often to the middle of the range. And yes, I've seen so much blood work that in most cases, on TRT, after 4 weeks, 6 weeks, 8 weeks, sex hormone-binding globulin is pretty close to favorable for anabolism and libido. Not too high, not too low. You don't miss out on anabolism and you don't miss out on libido. Now, in cases where you crush your sex hormone-binding globulin by overdoing the anabolics, including the dihydrotestosterones, you're going to, low test, high primobolan cycle, for example. Yes, your sex hormone-binding globulin is going to be abysmal, way below 10 nanomoles per liter. Not good for anabolism and not good for libido either. So what can we do to increase it? Well, there's several ways. You have to understand that sex hormone-binding globulin production in the liver is predominantly regulated by estradiol. So one way around it, or one way to keep sex hormone-binding globulin favorable and keep libido favorable, is by keeping your estrogen reasonably high. Not too high to the point you get gynecomastia, but not too low to the point you get libido issues. So where in most cases is that a good range? From what I've seen in most people's blood work, it's between 35 to 55 picograms per milliliter. Some guys do better on 75 picograms per milliliter, but usually above 75, people start to get estrogen issues like gynecomastia or acne or water retention, right? So maybe 75 picograms per milliliter is the highest tolerable range for most people. Some guys can go up to 100, some guys even 150, right? Individual response determines how high your serum estradiol should be. Of course, when you're taking a low dose of testosterone and a reasonably high amount of dihydrotestosterone or boldenone, which can lower serum estradiol concentrations and lower sex hormone-binding globulin concentrations from both ends by lowering estradiol and by increasing androgen delivery to tissue because you're on a reasonably high dose of androgens, which is going to lower your sex hormone-binding globulin concentrations quite significantly already, especially the dihydrotestosterone derivatives. So that's a little bit of a double-edged sword because you want all this anabolism, but you want to keep your estrogen and sex hormone-binding globulin favorable for libido. So that's one method to somewhat sustain your serum sex hormone-binding globulin concentrations by keeping your serum estradiol at the top or slightly over the reference range. Just keep in mind that the more anabolic androgenic steroids you take, especially dihydrotestosterone derivatives, the more your sex hormone-binding globulin concentrations will be suppressed, no matter how high your estradiol level is going to be. So you can get yourself into gynecomastia territory by really keeping your estradiol very, very high. And you can still get libido issues because the dihydrotestosterone derivatives are crushing your sex hormone-binding globulin concentrations, right? Keep that in mind. You have to find a good balance. Now, for the guys that also crushed their serum estradiol concentrations, resulting in very low sex hormone-binding globulin concentrations, there's a very easy protocol that I discussed previously in this video, and that's by taking reasonably higher dosages of human chorionic gonadotropin, dosages comparable to a typical post-cycle therapy, 1,000 to 2,000 IUs ACG every other day, because ACG produces testosterone and estradiol directly in the testicles, which is usually way faster than reducing the Arimidex or the Aromasin or the Letrozole, or changing the testosterone to dihydrotestosterone derivative levels, with the cycle design you were on, resulting in very low estradiol concentrations. So it's usually this ACG protocol that is able to restore estradiol concentrations, which then slowly brings up sex hormone-binding globulin concentrations because it's the estradiol that promotes SHBG production in the liver. Now, for a lot of guys that might still not get the ideal SHBG concentration, again, because their Arimidex and their dihydrotestosterone use is extensive, and then you might be able to get a little bit of estrogen-like effects by going on a selective estrogen receptor modulator like Tamoxifen or Raloxifene or Tormifene. I don't think Clomiphene is sustainable because, again, it makes you feel, not so good. And the potential for ocular damage or ocular changes by blocking the estrogen receptor in the eyes is probably not worth it. Again, I would only use Clomiphene during a post-cycle therapy, but not to restore sex hormone-binding globulin concentrations because you can get the job done with 10 milligrams of Nolvadex. And you could also combine 10 milligrams of Nolvadex before bed with 1,000 to 2,000 IUs of ACG to get the sex hormone-binding globulin production from Tamoxifen or another selective estrogen receptor modulator, which compounds with the increased serum concentrations of estradiol, which is slowly being produced due to the human chorionic gonadotropin that you're running. And it's another way to reasonably quickly restore sex hormone-binding globulin concentrations. And now, another method worth exploring, and might sound a little controversial for the guys that haven't been in the enhanced space or in bodybuilding for a while, and can consider all options, is to think about exogenous oral estradiol, because it's oral estradiol that goes into the liver directly. Now, when you look at ACG, or converting testosterone into estradiol, and keep your serum concentrations at the top of the reference range, that is systemic. The ACG produces estradiol in the testicles, it goes systemic, and whatever estradiol converts from testosterone is systemic also. And then you're basically rolling the dice. Entropy will determine how much estradiol is ending up in the liver, contributing to sexual hormone-binding globulin production. But you can force that. You can take control of that process by taking exogenous oral estradiol, which passes the liver right away. And then you need a reasonably low dose, because 100% of the estradiol ends up in the liver, and then part of that is metabolized into estrogen metabolites, or maybe, it gets glucuronidated and labeled for excretion to the kidneys. So even though a decent amount of that estradiol will go systemic, a larger portion of that will contribute to sexual hormone-binding globulin production. And these protocols work very, very well to restore sexual hormone-binding globulin concentrations. But again, not everybody responds favorably to it, and some guys just can't get over the mental roadblock that oral exogenous estradiol is going to contribute to their sex drive. So there's still compounds we can choose from. We can either choose from hormone replacement therapy, estradiol valerate, which usually comes in tablets of 1 to 5 milligrams. I would stick towards the lower end of that. 1 milligram of estradiol valerate maybe every other day to restore sexual hormone-binding globulin concentrations. And if you can't source that, because it's, a little bit more difficult to source, look into combination birth control, which contains ethinyl estradiol, albeit in much lower concentrations. I believe 1 tablet of birth control contains 25 to 30 micrograms of ethinyl estradiol. But it also contains synthetic progestins. There's many different kinds of combination birth control, so there's a lot of different synthetic progestins which are used as a contraceptive agent, right? And the estradiol is there to keep serum estradiol concentrations stable. It's a progestin that actually acts as a contraceptive. And that's why, 19-Nor's progestogenic anabolic androgenic steroids shut you down so hard. And of course, from the birth control, you might get a comparable effect by attaching to the progesterone receptor in the hypothalamus and the pituitary. Again, the dosages are very, very low, so it's not something you really have to think about. But again, it's an extra synthetic progestin in the mix that you have to keep into consideration. But it will work. Yeah? Oral combination birth control every day for 2 weeks, so that's 30 micrograms of ethinyl estradiol per day, raises sexual hormone-binding globulin concentrations quite a bit. You might get results in a week, maybe 2 weeks, but personally I would prefer estradiol valerate coming from estrogen replacement therapy tablets. 1 milligram every other day usually gets the job done. And again, it highly depends on how many androgens are in your bloodstream, because those will keep suppressing the sexual hormone-binding globulin that is being freshly produced in the liver. So there's 2 methods to directly stimulate sexual hormone-binding globulin production in the liver. One is with oral tamoxifen or another selective estrogen receptor modulator. And the other method worth looking into is oral estradiol, coming from estradiol valerate or ethinyl estradiol in combination birth control. Again, controversial, but sometimes you've crushed your sexual hormone-binding globulin so low, and serum estradiol concentrations are so low that you don't want to wait until the ACG starts to get into effect. And then oral estradiol is probably the quickest way to bring everything back up. Now, prolonged caloric restriction is also able to really bring up your sexual hormone-binding globulin. But from all the fasts that I've done, where calories are restricted to the lowest possible amount, and the only calories you're getting is basically from the fish oil and the, fat-soluble vitamins that you're taking, like ubiquinol or vitamin D3 or vitamin E. Those are all fat-soluble vitamins, and they contain a little bit of calories because, they're in gel caps with a little bit of oil within. So you get a little bit of calories from that way. But if you're on testosterone, any dose, even on hormone replacement, a week of fasting, I didn't really see any dramatic differences in sex hormone-binding globulin concentrations comparing the before and after. And that's even on a low dose of, well, it's higher than hormone replacement, but it's hormone replacement for bodybuilders, 250 milligrams of testosterone per week. Severe caloric restriction for a whole week or 5.5 days. I didn't see any dramatic changes in sex hormone-binding globulin. But when I was off the anabolics and I did this fasting mimicking diet, after 4 weeks, again, it's a little bit higher caloric intake than true fasting, so let's say 500 calories per day, but I did it for 4 times longer. My sex hormone-binding globulin came from 50 nanomoles per liter up to 120 nanomoles per liter. And again, that's the exclusion of exogenous anabolic androgenic steroids. And it's a severe caloric restriction for a prolonged period of time. Now, it's very difficult for most bodybuilders that trying to hold on to all of their gains. And let's be honest, during that fasting mimicking diet, I did end up looking pretty skinny. So I don't think that's a very sustainable approach to bring your sex hormone-binding globulin concentrations up back to, favorable ranges. Maybe you can do 2 weeks fasting mimicking, to bring it up to, let's say, from 5 nanomoles per liter to 15 nanomoles per liter. Maybe that's already too high. But again, if you're on exogenous androgens, I don't think it's going to come up that much, even with 4 weeks of fasting mimicking. But it's still a worthy endeavor to explore. So you see that with prolonged caloric restriction, that sex hormone-binding globulin concentrations tend to go up. But also with hyperthyroidism, which with prolonged caloric restriction, thyroid levels are generally low. Besides the thyroid-stimulating hormone, that's usually going to be elevated. But in cases of hyperthyroidism, whether that's clinical, being produced from the thyroid gland, or because you're taking exogenous T3, raising your total and free T3 concentrations to, hyperthyroidism levels, you see that sex hormone-binding globulin concentrations tend to go up a little bit as well. Now, it's a little bit difficult to determine because in most cases, T3 supplementation comes alongside a contest prep or a cutting phase where androgen levels are, quite high to sustain the amount of muscle mass from caloric restriction and taking exogenous T3. So you see that sex hormone-binding globulin kind of balances itself out and will still remain somewhat at the bottom of the reference range or below the reference range. And, when you're in a cutting phase or contest prep towards the end, the libido and anabolism is not going to be that good anymore anyway because of the caloric restriction for a prolonged period of time. Again, everything overlaps and contributes. But when you look at hyperthyroidism by itself, where total and free T3 and T4 concentrations in the bloodstream are chronically elevated, you see that sex hormone-binding globulin concentrations tend to be quite elevated as well. Again, it's a supraphysiological amount of androgens that is able to suppress SHBG when hyperthyroidism is basically self-induced during a cutting phase or a contest prep cycle. But when you look at hyperthyroidism by itself, it's this increased amount of thyroid hormones in the bloodstream that contributes to hepatocyte nuclear factor 4 alpha gene expression, which then contributes to sex hormone-binding globulin production in the liver. So now you have an increased amount of thyroid hormones and perhaps an increased amount of serum estradiol, which can both increase sex hormone-binding globulin production in the liver. So it might be advised, again, ideally you don't do this, but it might be advised if your sex hormone-binding globulin is really, really low and your estrogen is not that favorable, to do a combination of tamoxifen, human chorionic gonadotropin, and a low dose of 25 micrograms of exogenous T3 to really speed up sex hormone-binding globulin production in the liver, because all three can contribute, and it should be a very short protocol of 1 to 2 weeks. In many cases, that's enough to, restore sex hormone-binding globulin concentrations to libido and anabolism favorable ranges, being around the middle of the reference range. Let's say 25 to 35 nanomoles per liter. In most cases, anabolism is good and libido is good, between 25 to 35 nanomoles per liter. Now, there's another very close variant to sex hormone-binding globulin called androgen-binding protein, which is found in the testicles, and its production is predominantly regulated in the Sertoli cells and stimulated by follicle-stimulating hormone and testosterone. So a compound besides the human chorionic gonadotropin increasing estradiol concentrations in the bloodstream, cascading into sexual binding globulin production in the liver, you can also increase androgen-binding protein concentrations, which are very similar to sexual binding globulin, but mostly deliver androgens to tissue, and 17-beta estradiol, I believe. So it's the testosterone, dihydrotestosterone, perhaps dihydrotestosterone derivatives, and 17-beta estradiol that androgen-binding protein delivers through the sexual binding globulin receptor complex. Again, being closely related to sexual binding globulin, the androgen-binding protein can also attach to the SHBG receptor complex and deliver sex hormones to tissue. Now, these are produced in the Sertoli cells of the testicles, mostly regulated by follicle-stimulating hormone and testosterone concentrations. So a compound like human menopausal gonadotropin, which contains follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone, the follicle-stimulating hormone produces this androgen-binding protein in the Sertoli cells, and the luteinizing hormone produces testosterone, contributing to increased androgen-binding protein production in the Sertoli cells by increasing intratesticular testosterone concentrations. So that's another point for human menopausal gonadotropin use on cycle. Not only will it result in favorable sexual binding globulin concentrations, but you get a close variant of SHBG being the androgen-binding protein, allowing for an increased amount of sex hormone delivery through the sex hormone-binding globulin receptor complex. Now you're hitting it from two angles. So to summarize, if you've crushed your sex hormone-binding globulin concentrations to abysmal levels, look into Tamoxifen, which can directly produce sex hormone-binding globulin in the liver. Look into ACG if your estradiol concentrations are crushed alongside your crushed sex hormone-binding globulin concentrations. And now you raise your estradiol and your sex hormone-binding globulin, and your libido should return reasonably quickly as well. Maybe consider thyroid hormones. Again, thyroxine converts into T3, and T3 contributes to the hepatocyte nuclear factor 4 alpha gene expression, indirectly contributing to sex hormone-binding globulin production. And if you want to have a little bit more androgen-binding protein in your bloodstream, consider human menopausal gonadotropin, which produces this androgen-binding protein within the testicles through the Sertoli cells and by increasing intratesticular testosterone concentration from the increased amount of luteinizing hormone that you're now getting. So again, guys, crushed sex hormone-binding globulin concentrations are pretty easy to resolve. You just have to get a little bit creative sometimes and force it from a couple different angles. And once your sex hormone-binding globulin levels are favorable, again, your libido and your anabolism should be good to go. Really hope it helps. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you're looking for the most comprehensive guides to bodybuilding pharmacology, you can find the ebooks on my website, vigoroussteve.com/shop. If you're looking for personalized advice, you can find the rates to my services in the services section. Follow me on Instagram @VigorSteve. Vigorous crew, front double bicep for you guys. You guys are awesome. You guys know what to do. I'll see you guys in the next video. And hopefully by that time, your sex hormone-binding globulin is nice in the middle of the range. See you guys then.